Right, let's just see if he can. That's wonderful, John. Thank you for joining me. Thank you. How are you today?
I'm okay, Sarah Jane.
Good,
By the
good.
way, would you like to be called Sarah Jane or Sarah?
I don't mind.
Okay. Okay. So before we start, um, could you just tell me quickly what this interview, where it is going, and who the intended recipients are?
Well, the intended recipients are people who may be tuning into the Alteros magazine that I'm trying to run on Facebook.
And what is the context of Alteros?
Well, Yorkshire Yorkshire, the local and the global mixed.
And is it interested in psychology or science or spirituality or dogs? What is it?
Well, it's a magazine, magazines, not a specialty magazine, a specialty with wide ranging interests and so on. Yeah. It's meant to be helping to showcase local artists and craftspeople and so on. That's how I originally envisioned it,
Super.
but it's moved on from there a lot since then.
Okay, right. Well, we can start in a moment. What I suggest you do is, unless you're going to do video editing and you can edit off
I
this chat,
can do that.
you can do it. In that case, we'll just carry on then. I
I,
was going to suggest that you might want to um, switch off the recording and then switch on again and we can start. But it's perfectly okay if you can do the editing, then that's
well, if
lovely.
you want me to, I'll switch off and start again, but I'm worried that the second file won't get kept, John. So I would rather
Carry on with this one.
continue. Yeah.
Okay, so
Um,
ask away.
well, I was wondering how relevant you think that Extinction Rebellion still is in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis.
Okay, how relevant is XR with COVID? Well, I'm one of the founder members of XR York. I organised the first meeting in York. Hardly any people came, and a pair of students organised the second one, and loads of people came. So they really got it going. But I really warmed to XR as soon as I heard about it, because I had got to a stage in my environmental career, which started in the 1980s, where I have completely no hope at all for a sustainable future. All the evidence is that we're heading towards an absolute holocaust. Um, so one of the things that led me to XR was a poster saying, when hope dies, action begins. And that is how I tend to think. I'm very much into continuing to do direct action or non-violent direct action if I'm getting involved in something organized like XR, um, because although I don't see any major hope on the horizon to kind of save humans from their self-inflicted fate, I do see hope on the short term. So I think that we can look after each other. We can form closer communities. We can be more empathic towards each other and animals and nature. Um, and we can continue working to be low carbon, because if, and it isn't if humans aren't around for very much longer in a geological timescale, then I do believe that other organisms will survive us. And we need to leave a planet which is habitable by other organisms. This is absolutely clear that we are not the pinnacle of evolution. We are not the most important animal on the world in the world. Um, you know, woodlice and slime molds and oak trees are just as important. They're just as well evolved as we are, and they're not the ones who are driving the extinction event. So the way I see COVID is we're an animal, we're a naked ape, we're just a biological organism, and we get bacterial infections and virus infections, the same as any organism can get parasites or infections of other organisms living off it and using it as a host. So the fact that we get diseases doesn't surprise me, and the fact that there's an epidemic and now a pandemic doesn't surprise me, because I did epidemiology in my degree, and we looked at some of the previous pandemics and some of the previous causes of ill health. I did environmental health in my degree, and we looked at some of the causes of ill health, and obviously dirty water and infectious disease causes ill health in many countries, in many places. So the fact that there's an airborne virus doesn't surprise me. If you're looking at the threats to human society, COVID-19 is a small fish with sharp teeth, and it's a bit painful. It's snapping away. It's killing a few thousand people. It's infecting a lot more people, but not that many people die per infection. You know, there's only less than 1% of people who catch the virus actually will die from it. But we're heading up to a fairly sizable chunk of the population dying. And it's very disruptive when you don't want to have hospitals overwhelmed. So you do lockdowns to try and slow the rate that the infection goes through society. And of course, what we really want is to find a vaccine to then provide the herd immunity, which is the way that most viruses are prevented from spreading. And that'll mean that we can look after the most vulnerable people in society by giving them a vaccine rather than letting them chance getting the virus and dying. So it's a small fish with sharp teeth. A much bigger fish following on, a big shark, is the economic crash. Now, I'm not an economist, and I can't really argue strongly about why there is bound to be an economic crash, but I read, and I read what the economists say, and although I don't fully understand it, many economists are saying that our economic system is built on a very, very shaky foundation. It's built on borrowed money and kind of invisible currencies, and built on debt. And this is a very, this is a very risky thing, and it's very likely that there will be a massive economic crash sometime in the future. I'm not into making predictions time-wise. So that is a much bigger thing. It'll affect more people and will affect our lives more than COVID will. And then behind that, which is an absolutely humongous pair of jaws, much bigger than an economic crash, is the climate catastrophe. That will absolutely wreck everything. I think people know that the Paris Accord asked that countries try and limit their emissions to stop the average global temperatures getting more than 2 degrees C. That is because +2 is an absolute nightmare. +2 will devastate our communities and our society, and it isn't a good place. +2 degrees is not a good place, but we're heading for more than that. +4 is really a civilization collapse. I think most people who have read about these things know that our civilization would not cope with +4 and +6. This is all by 2100. +6 is human extinction, more or less. Now we're heading to +3.6 with the way that the Paris Accord is looking at the moment. We are not cutting our carbon quickly enough. There are many people and organizations which are invested in keeping us buying stuff, keeping us consuming meat, keeping us living the way that we're accustomed to. And then there's many developing countries which want to attain the standard of living and standard of consumption which many people in the West find normal, and people in the global South and the developing countries want to attain that. If they can do that with renewable energy and no resources, then that's great. But it actually involves using resources. So I don't see there's a way out of this. I think that we're heading to well over +2, and that's just looking at, if you think in graphs like I do, they are what I would call smooth line graphs. You can see the temperature going up with the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases being emitted, and they all intersect with 2100 as a line in the sand at a particular temperature. But that's global average, and what climatologists understand and the data shows is that the Arctic and the Antarctic are warming far more quickly than the equilateral and temperate regions. So the Arctic has warmed more than 10 times more what the mid latitudes have warmed. And what that risks is setting off tipping points and positive feedbacks, which are not positive. They're a very bad thing, which will skew this line very, very rapidly upwards. So it stops being a fairly smooth upwards and it goes into a much more steep curve upwards. And it would mean that we could very easily go above +4 degrees if some of these climate feedback loops take off. So that's why I would say I'm a doomer, but I'm living a good life. I live a very low carbon life. I do a fair amount of activism. I don't do a lot of sitting in the road, but I do stuff which is involved in trying to get people to be cohesive and kind and loving and be good towards nature, planting trees and not eating animals and not driving their cars and running over animals and stuff. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Right. Well, I think you are, having started Extinction Rebellion in York, I think you are, something of a hero for having done that. Definitely.
I never regard myself as a hero, and actually I would say I failed to get XR going because I did it far too quickly. I heard about XR and I contacted them and they said, we can have somebody up in York in a week if you like. And I said, let's do it. And in that week, I didn't do enough advertising, so I failed. And I got 6 people to the meeting and it was a damp squib. But I am well behind what XR is doing because it's clear that governmental democracy and first past the post has really failed us, and therefore the idea of a citizens' assembly is quite attractive. I don't know whether listeners understand what a citizens' assembly.
I myself don't quite, and I'm not I'm worried about the amount that local government might have to pay, and about us changing to local government completely, and that if the Parliament doesn't work and Westminster don't work anymore, and then I'm worried that it'll all get tribal, and that if we want to travel to Scotland, for example, or to Cornwall, that we'll risk getting mugged on the way on the train by people getting on at Cornwall, or when we get off at Cornwall, they'll mug us.
Do you know, I have a sense that the majority of people are good people, and they're not. The majority of people aren't violent or dishonest. The majority of people just want to get by.
Well,
And live their
that's it.
lives.
I'm worried that if the economic situation fails, that people will become desperate. And I've known York I've grown up in York, and it used to be really quite rough here, in many respects. And it became more gentrified and civilized. And I don't want it to get worse than even it was, and terrible.
I've been involved in a group called AVP, Alternatives to Violence Project, since my 20s, when I had one or two incidents in my own behaviour which I felt weren't in line with my belief systems of peace and love and blah 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 like that. So I actually got some help from Alternatives to Violence Project in understanding my own conflict behaviour. And yes, people do have conflicts, and people do lose their temper, and people do get mad at others and have a red mist event. But there are ways of reducing those conflicts and ways of coming out of those conflicts. If we had AVP training in schools, for instance, about conflict and communication, then there'd be far less conflict. Because if one person kicks off and nobody else responds to that, they can continue kicking off by themselves, and nobody's squaring up to them for a fight, because that's one of the best things you can do to avoid conflict is to turn around
It's
and
going to
walk
be about
away.
resources as well. I mean, for instance,
What?
if someone's desperate, they might become a contract killer for someone. Would they
What?
do such a thing? I hope not, but
What you're talking about is the collapse of civilization. So
Well,
civilization is
I'm well,
about
I'm told that in some places, like some South American countries, it is bordering on being like that, and has been for many years already.
yes. I think that collapse probably has begun, and is evidence of it in various places, especially some developing countries. But I'm not an expert on collapse. I know that people say that that the rise of fascism is connected with collapse, and certainly fighting over resources and not obeying the kind of broad rule of law is also something which is likely to happen in a society or a community that's collapsing and falling apart. And stopping being civilized. Being civilized is about being polite, fitting in with people, more or less following the rules. And I don't always follow the rules. I'm a bit of an anarchist in some ways, but I'm generally a good person, and I don't do things to sabotage other people or steal from them or whatever. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about what collapse will look like. There are places, there are universities which are doing courses on how civilizations collapse. And remember, all civilizations so far have collapsed. Every civilization you can name in the past has come and flowered and gone. And why should we think that our global civilization of capitalism is any different? It's built on very shaky foundations. So I think that our global civilization is going to collapse. But actually what that looks like is something I don't want to think about because it's messy and horrible and people die. Billions of people die.
Well, I'm
And
still
I like
wondering
people.
whether we can prevent it somehow, whether with forward planning a little bit. I know it seems now that we can only plan like the next week, if that. But if we do try and forward plan, I mean, things that give me hope are organisations like the World Meteorological Organisation, which is like a whole global organisation, and that does encourage cooperation.
I would really like the United Nations to be a stronger organization. I think if you're looking at tribalism, then having individual countries competing against each other is a bad thing. And cooperation, such as like the European Union, is a good thing. And the United Nations, if governed correctly and democratic, um, is a good thing and could lead towards or could have led to some solutions. Um, I don't believe we've got enough time left to achieve some of the solutions. For instance, we need to desperately decarbonize our energy. So we need to use a lot less energy, and that's going to be difficult, even with efficiency, with increased efficiency. We need to decarbonize. So we might say, okay, let's decarbonize with nuclear because it's very reliable, and it's proven. We've had nuclear power stations for 50 years, and they work, and they provide a kind of a base load, which is a centralized base load, which is what our current grid works on. But then we have people arguing, oh no, we don't need nuclear. We can do this all with renewables. Now we could
Well,
do,
China wanted to
we could
build a
do, but we
nuclear
need
power
a new
station.
grid for that. We need a new intercontinental grid for renewables to power Europe, for instance. And we would need a completely different infrastructure if we're going to. So we need a lot more batteries, and they take up a lot of resources. And we'd need other ways of storing energy for when it's dark and not windy, which because wind and solar are the best renewable energies. So I'm a big fan of renewable energy, but I don't ever pretend that we'll be able to run our entire society off renewables. Not not in the near future. We've got a long way to go. Renewable electricity is in the UK usually under 50% of the electricity that's being generated and being used, and over the year it's 20%. But electricity is only a quarter of the energy that we use. We use another quarter of the energy we use is gas, which is a fossil fuel. You can make it renewably, but it uses a lot of electricity to make it. And then another 50% of all the energy we use is liquid fuel, which is for
Sorry,
cars.
can you speak up? It's difficult to hear at the moment a little bit.
Okay. So 50% of the energy we use in the UK is liquid fuel, which is for, cars, taxis, vans, lorries, buses, trains, planes. And that is 99% fossil. There's a very small amount of ethanol, which is a biologically produced fuel. But so you can see how little of our UK energy is actually produced from renewable resources at the moment.
Yeah, I with this ethanol production thing, like I did hear that that's produced from corn and alcohol and stuff.
Ethanol is alcohol. Yes, what they do is they grow crops such as maize or sugar beet or potatoes. You can make alcohol from any starchy vegetable. Um, and then the starch and the sugars are extracted, and the starch can be broken down into sugars. It's a massive industrial process. It takes a lot of energy to boil up beet
Right.
or corn.
That's, yeah.
And then they brew it, which releases quite a lot of CO2. And then they distill that liquor, which uses a lot of heat, which has to come from somewhere. So they use gas for that. And in fact, it has been estimated that that the carbon benefits of using ethanol, this is in the United States, I think, a study in the US, were zero. There was no carbon benefit because so much carbon was used, fossil carbon was used in the production of the ethanol. So it's a scam. Now,
Right.
not saying that ethanol will is a scam now, and I'm not saying that it always will be. There may be ways of producing liquid fuel which are environmentally friendly and zero carbon, but I don't think we're there yet. So we've got a long way to go before we can cover all of the current energy. So what do we have to do? Cut our energy use. And who is willing to do that? Is anybody willing to give up stuff that they currently have? No, not very many people.
Well, I think that a lot of people will be willing to cut back, particularly given the economic circumstances.
By what,
Um,
80%? We need to cut back by 80%.
yeah,
Yeah,
I am,
that's a big
I still am thinking, John, that there might be some conspiracy that if there's a conspiracy and there's been climate modification experiments going on, then it means that the situation is remediable somehow and redeemable.
The climate experiment that has been going on is pumping many gigatons of fossil carbon into the atmosphere to fuel our Christmas lights and our flights to Ibiza for the weekend, etc. So that is the climate experiment that's going on. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I will always listen to conspiracy theories.
I know that some Russians were getting fed up of it being so cold there.
And
Well, I'm suggesting that the Russians might have warmed up the planet so that Russia's no longer cold.
well, I'm afraid that climate doesn't work like that.
Right. Okay.
Um, I
And
mean,
I'm not trying to
I
impute
could tell
anything
you
to Russia.
about, if you wanted, I could explain about how the jet stream works. And this is a fairly complicated climatic issue. And I know how it used to work, and I know how it works now, and I know why the wavy jet stream, which is caused by the Arctic being a lot warmer in comparison to the equilateral regions than it used to be, why that now leads to huge droughts and floods and fires and extended periods of rain in places. It's how the changing climate causes weather patterns, and so if somebody's got an idea that Russia is too cold, so they're going to try and warm it up, they'd actually do better to actually move and to go and live somewhere a bit warmer, like Mediterranean or somewhere, or southern Russia.
Right. Well, that's an interesting thought as well. I assume that we're going to, like, I don't know whether Britain will be bombarded with people fighting for space here as well, sort of in the future. I
Yeah.
mean, the floods are impending as well,
Uh,
or the
can
land
I can I just reply to that point? Is that there are very large numbers of people all over the world living just a few meters above sea level. So take Bangladesh, 80 or 90% of Bangladesh is within a metre or two of sea level. And there are places where the countries are already going underwater, like Kiribati and places in the Pacific, where a few centimetres of sea level rise is enough to flood their homes. So there are going to be plenty of places where sea level rise, and this is something that happens by 2 or 3 millimetres a year. So you say, well, that's not very much. That's every year. It just keeps on adding up. So we're expecting perhaps a metre of sea level rise, perhaps more, by 2100. Now, put a metre of sea level around London, and we should expect London to have some catastrophic floods by 2100. People will then have to move out of London, and they may want to move to places that are slightly higher in altitude. Where are they going to go if 1 million people move out of London? Because remember what happened to New Orleans. New Orleans had a big hurricane. It flooded, and because of the way that the low air pressure causes the sea to rise. There's a word for it, but I've forgotten. So New Orleans flooded. A lot of New Orleans has not been rebuilt. So the poorer people living in lowland parts of New Orleans moved. They moved to different parts of the US. Now, the US is a fairly large country with low population density in many places. So they were able to move to places with a low population density that could accommodate them. The UK is very, very high density. We should be expecting climate refugees within the country, and we should be expecting more climate refugees from outside the country to try and get on our shores. So yes, that we will be having to accommodate people who cannot live, like Syria, for instance. Syria
Right.
is at least partly a climate caused disaster. Not totally, because climate doesn't act on its own. Climate change doesn't work on its own. Climate change works alongside national politics and religious division and economic systems. So Syria was partly caused by a prolonged warming and drought, meaning that people moved towards the cities because they couldn't look after themselves in the country because their crops weren't growing. And the increased population in the cities partly caused a civil war. Hence, Syrian refugees washing up on our shores, and they're climate refugees, as far as I'm concerned. And there are other people. Oh, there'll be a few people disagree with me, but that's okay. We're allowed different opinions. What we've got to agree on is the facts. So the facts are that lots of people moved from the rural areas of Syria to the cities because their crops failed. Now, then you
Right.
have to ask, why did their crops fail?
Right. Okay. Right. Well, presumably because of the heat. Or was it the heat?
Yes.
Yeah.
Too many droughts, too many drought years.
Right.
Syria used to be a breadbasket. It was one of the places where the cradle of humanity started. 300,000 years ago, uh, and since then, it was a lush area, but no more. All the
Okay.
Middle East was a fantastically fertile area, but climate has always changed, and we've over the past million years, there's been a number of kind of ice ages or glacial periods which have changed the climate globally. But what human beings have done in the past 300 years is really quite amazing. The amount of greenhouse gases they've put into the atmosphere, and that's going to have a huge, huge impact in the next 2 or 3 generations.
Right. Okay. Um, I mean, there's more that we could talk about. I don't know. Do you want to talk about the resources part of the question? You've talked about climate change. Do we talk about how resources can be shared?
Yes, I would say that one of the problems when talking about resource use and pollution is that if you say, oh, the average carbon footprint is such and such, yes, that is a data point. You can take all the carbon emitted by a country and you can divide it by the number of people in the country and say this is the UK's average carbon footprint. I know about this because of my carbon footprint win in
Yes,
2008 when I won the
yes.
Oxfam competition, the lowest in the UK. Average was 6. My carbon footprint was 0.45.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, yes, but irrelevant. Because my own tiny carbon footprint is completely swamped by the number of people who have a carbon footprint of 12 tonnes or 24 tonnes or 48 tonnes. And there are people in the UK who have a massive carbon footprint. So I think what we need to look at with one of the ways that we could cut carbon, if you're still interested in doing that, which I am, is to look at the people who are emitting 20 tonnes and
Right.
try and stop them doing that. So there are, if you look at the number of people who fly, for instance, flying is a great way to increase your carbon footprint. And in any one year, less than half the UK population jump on a plane, excusing this year, which is a bit different. But on a normal year, the past 4 or 5 years, less than half the population has flown once. But a small number of people, 1 or 2%, fly dozens and dozens of times. And they pop off for a weekend in Monaco, and then the next weekend they say, how about we go to, we go for a long weekend in Barbados, and the next weekend they say, I've got to continue working, but the next weekend they say, I think we'd like to go and check out Athens, and they fly an awful lot. And we need to, I think we need a ration. I like the idea of
I
carbon.
think that would be a great idea.
Yeah. And that would mean that these people were allowed one flight every year, so a return flight every 2 years. And that would mean that I would be able to have a return flight every 2 years if I wanted to. I stopped flying in 1997. I decided that flying it didn't fit in with my worldview of wanting to be low carbon and kind and responsible. Flying isn't responsible. Flying is greedy and selfish, in my opinion. Other opinions are available.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you, John. I'm so glad that you've spoken to me today. And I'm hoping that you will keep well. And I'm hoping to keep in touch with you.
We chat on social media sometimes, don't we? And
Yes, we do. But
when this
I forgot to ring
COVID
you.
thing is gone,
I'll edit this out. But I forgot to ring. I forgot to ring you the other day on the Wednesday, didn't I? Was that okay?
okay. So, Jane, we have busy lives. We have stuff going on. I'm happy to chat to you. I'm happy to chat to anybody on social media. I have some interesting conversations, including with people who don't agree with my worldview and who have a different approach. And their views are interesting. Sometimes they're misinformed. Sometimes they tell me something and I then go and investigate it and learn something. So
Well, I'm
I've been,
glad that I'm hoping that you will be okay for the future as well, John.
well, who
And
knows?
thank you.
I could drop dead in a week, but
It's a,
I've had a good life, and I'm hoping to continue living because I've got a very, very exciting year next year. I'm involved in developing a bit of a new technology. I'm not going to say too much, but it's a new technology. It's very exciting. It's low carbon, and it's something which will touch everybody's life at one stage. So you will be able to interview me again if you wish when this technology is up and running, and we can talk about that then.
Okay, well, thank you so much, John, for sharing some of your views with me today. Thank
Nice
you
to
ever
chat.
so much.
Good.
Thank you, John.
Okay, cheerio.
Okay, thank you. Bye for now. Bye for
Bye.
now. Bye. Thanks, John. I don't know how to do this now. I've got to get my mouse working now. My mouse, like, I've got
can
so
switch off if
many
you like, or we
wires.
can.
Honestly,
You can switch off. You
where
can switch off the
the
recording.
wire for my mouse now is the mouse is, you know, seriously. It's all in a tangle again, and I untangled it on purpose. Is this
Sarah
mouse?
Jane,
No,
why
it's
don't you
not.
just switch off the recording and we can continue chatting for a bit?
Yeah, I would like to, but I can't find the mouse at all. It's honestly, my keyboard keeps failing and being unplugged as well, and all sorts keep happening. It's very challenging. The mouse is here. Okay, right. So if I do this, hang on.
Because you know why? I would like to
Recording.
continue
Stop.
chatting.
I'm worried that we might lose it all, though.
You won't. If you
Are you
stop recording,
sure?